Okay, perhaps I'll just start with a little illustration. When our family was still quite young and we had 5 kids, we were on holidays on the Murray River. We were living in Dandenong at the time, and we were on the holidays, and we were near the Murray River, and we went out to the edge of the river. Jenny was on the bank with the 2 youngest ones, and I went in the water to play with the 3 older ones with a big ball. And the water was stationary and it was nice and warm, and we played and we carried on, and after a while I looked up to see where Jenny was and the kids, and there was no car, no Jenny, no other 2 kids. And I sort of, a moment of panic, you think, oh, something's happened, she's probably had to rush off to hospital or something, you know, with one of the kids, and you panic. But what I realised had actually happened is that water that we thought was stagnant was actually flowing ever so slowly. And as we were playing, we had actually gone around a bend in the river. And that's what's happened with our culture. Culture doesn't change radically from one day to the next, generally speaking. It's a very, very subtle change. As I look into the audience, I see some people that are even a bit older than me who can probably remember the days when TV came into Australia. Yep, some of you can remember that. Well, when we came to Australia, I was a migrant kid from Germany in 1961, the next door neighbour had a TV, and once a week we were allowed to watch a program there. But, you know, in those days, if a married man kissed his wife on TV, that was pretty radical stuff. What do we see on TV today? It's ever so subtle. It's taken, 50, 60 years to kind of get to where we are today. It was just little by little by little by little, and most people don't take notice. So what's happened with the whole issue of sexuality and gender? What I'm going to do today is try and work out how this works. Oops. I think I was told that's the button moves down, is it? No. Ah, this is it. I think I'm getting the trick now. Yes, magic, it works, good. Okay, the 3 broad areas that I want to cover is just explain to you where's the history, or what's led to where we are today, so the past, what's led to the changes in thinking about sexuality and gender. Then we'll take a few questions, and then I'm going to talk about the present, what's taught in our schools today, and then talk about the future. What are the implications for education in schools and for parental rights? What are the implications for the Christian community? Now, in this whole thing of gender, we can take it all very seriously. How many genders are there? If you had $2, or no, to say, if you had $1 for every gender that there is, how rich would you be? I like this little picture that somebody sent me. If I had $1 for every gender there is, I'd have $2 and a bunch of counterfeits. So that's, I thought, quite clever. Okay, so where's the past been? Basically, Christianity has shaped Western culture. There's no question about that. And then we're going to have a look at how Marxism has influenced our culture, and particularly the so-called Frankfurt School, and then the Frankfurt School, or the neo-Marxists, march through the institutions. The way that the church, or the Christianity, so influenced Western culture originally was because when the Roman Empire collapsed, one of the very few institutions that actually survived the collapse of the Roman Empire was the church. And so, because of the vacuum, the church was not only the church, but also filled the role of civil government. And because of that, the nobility eventually, with the rise of the nobility, they owed their power to the church. And so, with the influence of the church, it was inevitable that Christianity had a profound influence on the shaping of Western culture. And one of the most radical things in terms of culture is actually the doctrine of creation. The fact that we believe that God created every human being in his own image, because that, by definition, gives enormous dignity to every human life. And that has very much shaped our culture. Because in all other cultures, life, human life, is nowhere near as valued as it is in the Christian world view. And the other thing about Christianity is that we believe in a God who's revealed himself as a God of order, and that makes science possible. Because if you believe that the gods are so capricious and unpredictable, then everything is unpredictable. And so the whole notion of science and discovery, that there are systematic laws in nature, that would all be foreign. The problem with the church having total power just about was that the church became totalitarian. And this year we celebrate 500 years since the Reformation. And most of us living today, we don't realise just how radical Martin Luther's ideas were. In bold there, that's just a quote of what he said at the Diet of Worms, and incidentally, diet is not what you eat, but that was just the name of a civil court. And at the end of the case of his heresy trial, he basically says that he's convicted by the testimony of Scripture, and he's captive to that, and acting against one's conscience is neither safe nor sound. You know, we think that's very sensible. But that was totally radical. It was unthinkable. It was, to be in possession of Luther's writings at the time was a capital offence. You'd be executed for even possessing his writings. That's how radical and subversive that stuff was. And the whole thing led to what we might call a change to a new individualism. Before, the church decided what you had to believe. The civil courts enforced that. If you thought different, you better keep your mouth shut, because otherwise you get burnt at the stake or executed some other way. With the Reformation came this new individualism, that every person had the right to live under the authority, as they understood it, of the Word of God. And that was just totally radical. Going to take a quick jump in history. Then came along the Enlightenment, and those of you who are historians are going to shudder because I'm jumping too quickly, but we need to understand the Enlightenment in the sense that there was an intellectual movement that said that everything can be known by reason. That reason was the most important and the only thing that really mattered. And that led to a growing confidence that man could, or humanity could basically sort out all its own problems by reason. We didn't need to rely on God, and it led to what's called deism, the idea that, well, God exists, but he created everything, but he wound it up like an alarm clock, put it on the mantelpiece and stands back and he just watches it tick along. God doesn't interfere with the rules of nature or anything like that. And the only reason they believed in God was because, well, where could creation have come from if it wasn't by God? And so that's why when Charles Darwin came up with his theory of evolution, the people of the Enlightenment, they jumped on that because now they had an excuse to get rid of God, because they'd been trying to get rid of God for ages, but they couldn't deal with that because of creation, or the first cause, or where did life come from, where did creation come from. But the Enlightenment, in a sense, within itself had the seeds of its own destruction, in that people realised that reason doesn't answer the questions of life. The human spirit needs more than just reason to make sense of the world. Then I'm going to jump to Karl Marx. He issued his Communist Manifesto in 1848, and Marx saw the family as the key obstacle to achieving his dream of a communist utopia, because families are this terrible place where parents instill values into their children, and the idea that that the state should be the ultimate thing was something that was so foreign, and the parents wouldn't teach their kids that. So it was important to abolish family. And he actually wanted to abandon or abolish marriage, family, and the idea was, and Karl Marx's idea was, that people could have sex with whoever they wanted to. If children were produced, those children then given to the state, and the state raises those children. And they would then become good little communists. Then we come to a point where, in history, where the working class failed to actually embrace the Marxist revolution. The working class just didn't seem to have what it took to make Marx's dream come true. And then you had people like Antonio Grassi and I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, Georgi Lucas, and other Marxist academics. They decided that the Christian-based civilization of the West was the obstacle to achieving the Marxist utopia. And so they turned it around. They said, what we've got to do is we actually got to target the elites of society, the media, schools, university, government, judiciary, and even church leaders to promote their cause. And the tool that they used was what's called critical theory. In other words, you attack every aspect of Western civilization. The idea is you want to deconstruct everything, and anything of the West is portrayed as evil, corrupt, authoritarian, and oppressive. And this Frankfurt School became known as cultural Marxism, and Hitler didn't like communists, and many of these people were Jewish as well, so they kind of saw the writing on the wall and they fled to the United States, where they got jobs in some good universities, and they didn't appreciate the freedom they had in the United States, and so they continued to teach the Marxist sort of philosophy, and were able to influence US culture in a very significant way, which then in turn influenced other, like their teaching at the universities impacted a lot of other people, and others took that on board. And their teaching was that oppressors were always Western Christian civilization, the traditional nuclear family, parents, the white heterosexual male, the Christian church, and capitalists and anybody of conservative sort of values. And so that was something that was being peddled throughout the universities, and started to be peddled in the media and so on, and started to be portrayed in movies and so on. So it started to really shape culture. So that leads to the whole thing of, oops, I went to there, capturing the culture, and it led to a whole era of, we know, in the 60s, 70s, of the permissive sexuality, and basically it was to undermine the institution of the family. And there's a quote there from Reich, who was one of the Frankfurt School academics: "The patriarchal family is the structural and ideological breeding ground of all social orders based on the authoritarian principle." And so it had to be destroyed. And they taught that all sexual repression must be eliminated, and that ties to parents must be undermined. And Gabrielle Kubi, who was at the Australian Christian Lobby Conference, she's a German lady who's studied a lot of this stuff, she says, Reich recognised that the total sexualisation of the culture would mean extermination of the churches and the traditional state, and this was his goal. That's what he sought to have. So the strategy was, oops, hang on, jumped. The strategy was basically, how can you capture the culture? They did that by creating victim groups. Herbert Marcuse, he argued that tolerance of all views, which was very much the Western philosophy that, hey, if you think that, you're entitled to that, we have freedom of speech, that if you tolerate all viewpoints, that actually equals oppression of the victim groups. And so they wanted what they called repressive tolerance, that you tolerate only the movements of the left, and you do not tolerate any of the movements or views of the right or the conservative side of society. So they taught that you should be intolerant and repressive in the name of tolerance and liberty, which is what political correctness is actually all about. You know, it was interesting during the same-sex marriage campaign. Some of you may know I was the campaign director for the Coalition for Marriage in Western Australia, and at one time this guy came up to me when we were waving our signs, and he said, you know, you're engaging in hate speech. And I said, beg your pardon? What's hateful about saying I want the law to stay as it is? And he said, you don't understand. And I said, you know, I don't quite get what you're talking about. And he basically said I had no right to exercise my freedom of speech because he found my view offensive. And I kind of said to him, well, what's your definition of a bigot? A bigot is a person who will not tolerate anyone else's view. I said, I tolerate your view, you won't tolerate mine. So actually you're the bigot, not me. But the whole thing's been turned around, and the media and in academia, that's very much the push, is that the victim group, you're not allowed to do anything that upsets them. And so, in a sense, the victim group is given higher rights and privileges than the rest of society. And it's this ideology that's the source of the new intolerance to biblical values and of conservatives and Christians generally. Now, in case you kind of think this is all very theoretical, let me just take you to a couple of things before we open up for questions on this. Oops, that jumped too. The Rose Hotel in Chippendale, New South Wales, banned the Young Christians group Theology on Tap. It's a Roman Catholic group. They get 200-300 young people there at this pub, and they get guest speakers. They do it every month or so. And they've been using this pub for quite a number of years. And because they had a nun coming along, and it was the time of the same-sex marriage thing, the LGBTI activists, they totally bombarded that hotel management and threatened violence and everything else. So the hotel said, sorry, we're cancelling your booking. So that is the kind of intolerance. Now you ask yourself, hang on a minute, who's actually the victim group? The LGBTI lobbyists, activists, they're actually the bullies. Who's the victim? It's actually these young people who want to exercise their freedom. And this next one is a real ripper. James Caspian is a psychotherapist who works with transgender people and all that, and he wanted to conduct research about people who reversed their gender assignment surgery, because quite a lot of people who have the transgender surgery, 7, 8, 9, 10 years later, they actually want to go back to what they were, but you can't do that. So he wanted to do some research, what's the dynamics around that, and his research for a master's degree in counselling and psychotherapy at Bath Spa University was blocked by the ethics committee because it's best not to offend people. The mind boggles. When I went to university, universities were places where you could challenge ideas, and as long as you could argue your case reasonably, you're entitled to that view. But the university wanted to avoid the criticism that might arise if he found something that was politically incorrect, because the media all tell us that transgender people are so happy about their sex change operations and all that. And generally speaking, they are for the first 5, 6, 7 years. But in Sweden, which was at the forefront of that kind of surgery, what they've discovered is after 7 years, the successful suicide rate of the people who've had the operations ends up being 20 times that of the general population. You won't see that in the newspaper very often, I can assure you, but they're the facts. But because those facts are offensive, that's why you don't publish them, and you don't allow research in that field. And then the other one, some of you may have seen that, I think it was in the Australian, the intolerance of those who claim to stand for diversity. And this totally tops it off, I reckon, is, oops, hang on, I've jumped one. Hang on, what's happened here? This one here. The British equivalent of the Bureau of Census and Statistics, they put out a report that asking people on the census whether you're male or female is discriminatory, it's intrusive. And they're actually talking about dropping that question, whether you're male or female, which will mean that the British government will actually not know how many males or females there are, which has a lot of health, for health reasons and medical needs and so on, won't know those figures because it might be upsetting to some victim group in our society. And so you might say, okay, why has all this actually happened? How come this cultural Marxism stuff has got such a grip on our society? And I want to be very blunt, and I believe it's because of the failure of the church. It is the failure of the church in the sense that we have failed to engage with our community. You know, in a democracy, we all have a responsibility to choose who governs us. But for too long, Christians have actually retreated from the marketplace of ideas, and we've left it to the pagans to run the country. And when it goes wrong and doesn't go our way, we think, oh, isn't this all terrible? But who have we got to blame other than ourselves? And the other big aspect is that Christianity itself, or the church in terms of the way that A.W. Tozer puts it, Christianity is decaying and going down the gutter because the God of modern Christianity is not the God of the Bible. And I think that's a really key issue to ask ourselves is, you know, if we abandon biblical teaching, what is actually left of Christianity? If Christianity doesn't, if our Christianity is not grounded in the Word of God, then what's actually the point of going to church on a Sunday? We hear somebody speak. If they're not actually teaching us from the Word of God, might as well be out playing golf, might we not? So I think that's a real issue that we, as a churches, we need to ask ourselves, how have we contributed to this and what can we do to bring about change? And as somebody at the ACL conference quote, I'm not sure who originally said it, but when the majority remain silent, they are no longer the silent majority. What is taught in our schools today? Well, I'm not sure whether you like that. I didn't make that up. That comes out of an article in The Spectator, where an MP wrote an article about what's happening. And I think it pictures it rather well. I'm not sure whether you can read it there. But it says identity politics, redefining marriage, safe schools, gender fluidity, and hate speech. They're all sort of the rockets that are being fired at at Western civilization. And so what's happening in our schools today? What's happening in our society? And again, we need to think about something that happened when in the mid-70s, some of you may be old enough to remember Don Dunstan, the Premier of South Australia. He decriminalised homosexual acts between consenting adults. Before that, throughout the Western world, sodomy was considered a criminal offence. And the view was increasingly that, hey, what two people do in their bedroom, that's nobody else's business. And most people thought, yeah, that's fair enough, I suppose. But the problem was, once you decriminalised homosexuality, that it was no longer a crime. That meant you could actually promote it. So because you're no longer promoting criminal activity. And so it could be openly discussed. It could even be talked about in schools and so on. And then what happened next is that all of a sudden the gays become a victim group, that they're one of the groups that is being oppressed by the rest of society, supposedly. And as John Wesley said, what one generation tolerates, the next generation will embrace. And I think that's very much what has happened here. I'm sure you've all heard of the Safe Schools program. And there are over 30 schools in Western Australia that have signed up to it. It was something that was spearheaded by the Gay Lesbian Health in 2010 in Victoria. And in Victoria, as of next year, it's going to be compulsory. The Labor government of Andrews in Victoria is making compulsory next year. And in Western Australia, some 30 schools have signed up to it. Now, why have they done that? Our kids are being taught that gays are being bullied terribly at school. And if that was true, that would be a terrible thing. The people, the ARCHS, which from La Trobe University, which produced the Safe Schools program, they claim that homophobia has increased rather than decreased over the past 5 years. And you read all these things and you think, is it actually true? The principals who were quoted in the Proud Schools consultation, they field tested the Safe Schools type of program in New South Wales in a bunch of schools, and the principals were asked to give feedback, and the principals never once said that homophobic bullying was a problem in their schools. And in fact, in New South Wales, The law says, the Education Department regulations are that any serious issue of bullying has to be reported by the school to head office. Guess what? In New South Wales, on that bully register at the head office, there is not one single case of gay bullying recorded. But it's such a big problem, we need to run this program. How does that happen? In Canada, they've done some very extensive research on bullying, and that graph there, they've got about another 10, 15 long, and gay bullying is right at the far end. When you look at what bullying happens in schools, body image is by far the biggest issue, and the grades, you're too clever, too dumb or whatever. Racial background, language and gender, that's not about being gay or lesbian. That's about, I'm not going to play with you because you're a boy, and I'm not going to play with you because you're a girl or whatever. It's that kind of stuff. Religion, income and so on. So in terms of bullying in schools, the actual research indicates that it's minuscule. But we've got this Safe Schools program in our schools. This is a schematic presentation or representation of the original Safe Schools program. And people say, oh, but the federal government rejigged it. Well, that's true. The only problem is the Victorian government has embraced the original version. That original version is on the Education Department website in Victoria. And the Safe Schools button there in the middle, one click takes you to the -18, because that's a link they've got on there, and that takes you then with one further click to sex shops, to gay bar stuff, and this is for year 7 and 8 kids, right? Sexually explicit videos are just a couple of clicks away. It's just unbelievable that people would have even tried to do that. There's been quite a reaction to it, but the media and that was so slow to actually respond in reporting that, but eventually things started to happen. Now, what's actually happening under the Safe Schools program? What our children are being taught is that heterosexual relationships are not the norm. Now, my background is agriculture, and I would put it to you that our sheep industry, our cattle industry would collapse if heterosexual relationships were not the norm. Or am I missing something? And I suspect if heterosexual relationships weren't the norm, most of us probably wouldn't be here either. Transgender students are allowed to use uniform, toilets and change rooms of their choice and can play sport in the team of their choice. And gender and sexual diversity is integrated in all subjects across the curriculum. The idea of that is that you can't take your kids out of the class because, hey, you can't take them out of maths or out of every other class because the idea is they want this permeating the whole school in every subject. The material teaches kids they've got 2 virginities, the first time with a boy and the first time with a girl. In other words, trying to normalise same-sex relationships. It asserts that your sex is determined by the bits on your body, but your gender, that's what you decide you want to be. And that can fluctuate like the weather. Today it's fine, tomorrow it's raining, or today you can be male, more male inclined, tomorrow or in a week's time you can be more female inclined, and that's okay. Yes, I don't know what you're thinking, but I kind of think this is crazy. And it makes light of sexually transmitted diseases. It actually says, well, you can go to the doctor and get antibiotics and it kind of fixes it. The original version taught girls how to bind their chests so their breasts won't develop if they would rather be a boy and so on. And every school was supposed to set up, oops, I'll jump one there, gender diversity action groups. And that's in a state, in Victoria, remember they tried to ban Bible study where students were, if students wanted to meet in a classroom for Bible study at lunchtime, the Minister of Education issued an edict that that was not permitted. But in those very same schools, gay, lesbian, transgender interested kids were supposed to be given a special space with a special notice board where they could meet and have the support of teachers. Can you see? The poor victim group, but who are actually the victims? They also had provided an audit tool to keep a written record of individual student and staff attitudes and opinions on homosexuality and all of that. Sounds a little bit like thought police to me. And the acceptance and promotion of the LGBTI rights agenda to the exclusion of any other viewpoint. So they claim they want to embrace diversity, but they don't. They only want one worldview, and if you have another one, that's not permissible. It tells them to do homosexual sex when they feel ready, but the whole program does not mention once anywhere the minimum legal age for sexual activity. It fails to educate kids about the risks of same-sex activity. Incidentally, how many of us know that for men who start engaging in sodomy at the age of, say, 18, 19, 20, most of them, by the time they're in their mid-40s, actually are fecally incontinent and need to wear nappies, because the anus was designed as a one-way street, not as a two-way traffic. You're not allowed to talk about these things. And James Parker mentioned that at one of the talks he gave where I was present, and I was present when afterwards a GP who was in the audience came up to him and said, "Thank you so much for saying that." He said, "If I would mention that publicly, I'd get struck off the register, but you're dead right. I've seen it so often myself." So the kids need to be taught about these things if we're going to teach them fairly about homosexual relationships. And the Safe Schools program claims to be evidence-based. You hear this evidence-based thing all the time, but the shonkiness of the research that goes into this is unbelievable. The program is based largely on so-called research findings for the Writing Themselves In program. That program was a paper survey that used to be sent to schools, but a lot of schools stopped doing this, very explicit sexual questions, and a lot of parents objected to it, so principals didn't want the hassle, so it kind of died. But then it was resurrected by advertising this survey on gay and lesbian websites. And the figures that they use for their research is the percentage of people who actually filled that in by going to those websites, finding the survey, then filling it in. 17% of the people who responded said they were homosexual, transgender or lesbian or whatever. The conclusion drawn, 17% of students in our schools are gay, lesbian or transgender. I mean, you would, if you did research methods at university and you tried to dish something like that up to your lecturer, when I was at uni, you would fail. You'd get 0 for your assignment if you tried to dish that up. But that's what gets dished up and gets peddled as fact. The sorts of things that they want you to... Oops, that's gone a bit fast. Oops. I'll get there yet. A poster, a boy wearing a girl's uniform, because everybody should be able to wear the uniform that makes them feel comfortable. And what about this one? Gross. Being straight is totally just a phase that you go through. Because the real cool thing is to be gay, of course, or transgender. And even if your school hasn't signed up for Safe Schools, this booklet, little kids book, The Gender Fairy, on page 28 is, actually just to explain the story, there's these two kids and am I a boy, am I a girl? They're not sort of sure and all that, and the Gender Fairy tells them, only you know whether you're a boy or a girl. Your mum and dad don't know, the teachers don't know, only you know. And that's a book that's supposed to be read to 4-year-olds. The program purports to celebrate diversity, but it won't tolerate expressions of traditional Christian, Muslim, Jewish morality, or even Eastern morality. And in New South Wales and Victoria, it's led to kids who are brave enough in that context to express traditional views. They're getting bullied, not just by kids, but by teachers as well. And kids are forced to celebrate homosexuality, which incidentally is contrary to Article 14 of the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, because kids are allowed to be brought up by the values that their parents have. So basically what's happening is our kids are being indoctrinated with queer theory. And queer theory, I'm not using it as a derogatory term, that's what the academics actually refer to it as. It's called queer theory, so I'm not being dismissive of it or anything like that. But it's about imposing this totally unfounded in science queer theory and this gender fluidity ideology on our kids. Kids are being told, and teachers are being instructed at our universities, where they're doing their training, do not stand in front of a class and say boys and girls, because not everybody would identify as a boy or a girl. So just say students or something, a neutral term. If you address a group of parents, never say ladies and gentlemen, because not everybody would identify as a gentleman or a lady. So they're trying to degenderize society. And also, when a baby is born, don't ask whether it's a boy or a girl, because the child hasn't a chance to make up its mind yet. Now, you laugh, but I mean, that's not happening in our society yet. But I was talking to a Swedish young lady who's a lawyer. She lives here in Perth, and she was telling me a few weeks ago that amongst her age group in Sweden, if you have a baby, it's totally politically incorrect to ask whether it's a boy or a girl. And if you're foolish enough to ask that question, the answer you will get from most young parents is, we don't know yet, it's too early to tell, because the child hasn't made up their mind. And then we wonder why there are problems with kids with gender dysphoria. Okay. Just quickly, to tie it back to what I said earlier, Ros Ward, who is one of the chief authors of the Safe Schools program, she's a dedicated Marxist by her own admission. She's one of the key speakers at the Marxist conferences, and she believes that LGBTI oppression and heteronormativity are woven into the fabric of capitalism, and therefore the nuclear family and the idea that people should live in families must be eliminated. That's not me talking, that's her talking. People with that view writing education programs for our kids. So basically what she's saying is the traditional family, the conventional ideas of male and female, heterosexual marriage, they're all just a nasty capitalist plot. And she was actually caught on at a professional development day she was doing for teachers, where somebody recorded on their iPhone. She actually admitted that it's not an anti-bullying program we're running. This is about promoting sexual and gender diversity. And you can look it up on YouTube, it's there. In terms of the kind of people that are running these things, the Australian Research Centre of Sexual Health and Society, Professor Gary Dowsett, wrote this: first, we have 3 legal social questions to win: custody rights for gay men and lesbians, the legal right of pedophiles and their young loves, and finally, the sexual rights of children as a whole. People like that, right, teaching people at university who are going to be our teachers, who then teach our children. And these people are writing programs. And the next quote there, the current pedophilia debate then is crucial to the political process of the gay movement. Pedophiles need our support, and we need to construct the child-adult sex issue on our terms. Okay. I'll skip the next one because we're running out of time. Now, you might think, wow, this Safe Schools thing, we've got to fight this, and I agree we do, but the sad thing is, it's actually just one program in a bigger suite of programs that come under the heading of comprehensive sexuality education. Building respectful relationships is another one, Catching on Early, Start Early initiative, that teaches toddlers about sexuality, cross-dressing, and that their gender is fluid. And the sad thing is that our teacher unions in Australia are fully supportive of all this stuff. Okay, I'm going to skip the next one for time. Oops. And just in case you wonder, this is a book that's used in early childhood education of people who are going to be teaching kindergarten. And it's, if you go to the next one, I'll show a page in that. And it's the quote there, it doesn't matter what the parents' views are on this subject. You just teach. Don't worry about what parents say. And the weird world that our kids are going to be growing up in, if this continues, is this picture, which some of you will find it offensive, but it was a front page cover of Time magazine a little while ago. Here you have a woman who wants to be a man, who's taken male hormones and all of that, so he has a beard and everything, but now is actually having a baby and feeding a baby. What confusion does that give a child? If you want to deal with this issue of safe schools and what's going on in our schools, take an active interest in your local school, talk to the principal or chaplain about what is actually being used, and if safe schools and other comprehensive sexuality education material is being used, take a delegation to your principal. Don't go on your own. It's too easy for them to knock you down. Get half a dozen or more parents who are of like mind, suss out who they are, and then go as a group and then ask for an audience with the principal. Because if you go on your own, you'll get slapped down. You're just a fuddy-duddy and you're a Christian or whatever they're going to call you. It doesn't matter. Okay, next one is questions. I'm just wondering whether I should quickly do the implications for that because we're going to run out of time. Is that okay, Barbara? Yep. Okay. Okay, so what's the future for us? And when I say us, I mean as a Christian community and for our children. The same-sex marriage survey that's come through and given the okay to move ahead with same-sex marriage being made law, you will find that in every country where that has happened, it's led to a great emboldenment of the LGBTI lobby, and they then, that kind of gives the okay to reinterpret anti-discrimination laws to attack Christians and traditional views even more, and leads to significant erosion of freedoms, and it leads to far more radical sex education in schools. And you may remember I spoke about the Marxism thing about the repressive tolerance only of the movements of the left and intolerance of the movements of right, conservative, traditional kind of values. You will see a massive increase of that in the coming year or two, for sure. And you will experience far more intolerance and repression in the name of tolerance and diversity. And there's a big push already to prevent Christian schools from only employing Christian staff. You can employ them initially if you get away with that, but if, like at that school, the Baptist school down in Rockingham, where a teacher turns out to be in a same-sex relationship, which violates the standards that the school wants kids to have modelled for them, the push is on that, hey, you can't sack a person for that anymore. And the difficulty is that LGBTI rights in the courts, once same-sex marriage has been legislated, you'll find that always the LGBTI rights trump every other right. So your right to religious freedom is always subservient to the rights, in inverted commas, of the LGBTI and so on. You'll find that the Safe Schools program will become compulsory. It's going to be compulsory in Victoria. The teacher training, as I mentioned already, is so steeped in gender theory, and the whole push is on to degenderise our education. And homosexuality and transgenderism is to be celebrated, and heteronormativity is a bad word. And the move is actually to homo superiority. Teaching kids that being gay, lesbian, transgender, that's the coolest thing in the world to be. And you as a parent will no longer have the right to take your kids out of that kind of setting. Let me take you quickly to Britain, where there was the Visionist Girls' School, a school that used to do quite well in its annual inspection from the British education authorities. After same-sex marriage came in, all of a sudden, the school was being marked down because the staff and the parents and the board refused to teach the children, their 4-year-old to 11-year-old girls, about homosexuality, transgenderism, and that gender is fluid. And the British authorities are threatening to close the school at the end of this year because they've warned the school 3 years in a row and said, you haven't changed, we're going to shut you down at the end of the year. Another ripper one in Britain is Felix Nigoli. He was kicked out of his social work course at Sheffield University for posting on his Facebook that he holds a traditional Christian view of marriage and sexuality. The faculty decided that anyone who holds such views is unfit to be a social worker and therefore expelled him from his course. Consequences for sex education. Heterosexual and homosexual relationships will now be on an equal level because of same-sex marriage. Therefore, both will be taught as being equivalent. And the whole gender fluidity thing, you can be sure, will also happen. The push is already on for school uniforms to be unisex, and that kids can use the bathrooms of the opposite sex if they choose to identify as being of the opposite gender. The sad thing is that 98% of confused boys and 88% of gender-confused girls eventually accept their biological sex after naturally passing through puberty. That's from the DSM, that's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, which is sort of the psychiatrist's Bible, if you like, for mental disorders and that. So that's a direct quote from that. And don't forget, why would you want to push kids into the direction of transgenderism when their suicide rate is 20 times that of the rest of the population? There's going to be consequences for freedom of speech. Most of you will be familiar with the case of Archbishop Porteous, and that happened already about a year ago. Oh no, it's more than that. It was in the lead up to the last federal election. A Greens candidate who's transgender took Archbishop Porteous to the Anti-Discrimination Commission because he issued a booklet that outlined Catholic teaching on marriage. And the transgender person felt offended by that. Under Tasmanian anti-discrimination law, it's an offence to offend somebody who has a protected attribute, and being transgender is one of those protected attributes. So if you offend them, you are breaking the law, you are in trouble. Because of the publicity generated, the transgender person actually withdrew the case just before the federal election. So we don't actually know whether Archbishop Porteous actually broke the law or not. Dr. Pansy Lai, she's a GP in Sydney. She was... because she exposed some of the things in the Safe Schools program, she was actually, there was a put up this big petition that within days had over 5,000 signatures on it that she should be deregistered because she was unfit to be a GP because she exposed the content of a particular program. Some of you would have seen this one. Madeline, a young girl in New South Wales, sacked for putting on her Facebook page that she was voting no. So what can we do for our children? I believe we've got to equip our youth to argue against gender theory. Don't think it's one of those things that's just going to go away. It will not go away because they're going to be bombarded with it from every corner. If your kids are going to go to university, especially in the arts kind of field or education field, they will be absolutely hammered with it. And if they dare speak up in their tutorials, they will get hammered, absolutely hammered by the lecturers. Make no mistake about that. I've had some people come to me who a mature age student who's doing education at the moment at one of the universities here in Perth, and she said it's just not game to even say that she doesn't agree with it because the attitude of the tutor is so vitriolic and belittles any other view, even though nobody's expressed another view in the class. She said she's just not game to do it. And the other thing is we need to protect our young children who are so impressionable from this whole gender theory stuff. And I think we need to really make sure that we focus on solid biblical teaching in our churches, that everybody is made in the image of God, loved by Him. We created male and female. The gender is binary. And we need to be compassionate for people who suffer from gender dysphoria and same-sex attraction. It's part of the fall into sin. And as the opening devotion Mark shared with us, it's so true that, hey, we all sin, we all fall short, but we should not celebrate the fallenness of man. We should celebrate the healing, the newness of life that Christ gives. That's something to celebrate. And the Bible is pretty clear that homosexual acts are not something that God takes pleasure in. In fact, Leviticus describes them in the NIV as detestable. Romans 1, Paul talks about it. And the real challenge for us is that Romans 12 makes it so clear, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds. How does that happen? Through the Word and the Spirit working in us. So we really need to teach our kids the facts. The fact that we, for example, the notion that people are born gay. It's absolute rubbish. The identical twin studies have shown conclusively that that is not the case, and yet it keeps getting peddled. It's a fallacy. It's simply untrue. Sex change, it's actually an impossibility because every cell is either male or female. It has that in the chromosomes. As somebody put it, legalising a lie doesn't make it truth. Homosexual lifestyle leads to a shortened lifespan. There are medical issues involved. And homosexual relationships are largely transient. They tend to have a very high drug use rate, much higher sexually transmitted diseases, much higher suicide rate. And homosexual bullying in our schools, principals tell me, is actually exceedingly rare, because most gay kids are actually quite popular, because they're, a lot of the TV programs, it's the gays are always the cool dudes, and so if a kid is gay, they're the cool dudes at school. Okay. And let's not forget to pray. Pray for the preservation of freedom of speech and conscience, because what can easily happen, and that's actually one of the reasons I ran for Parliament, was because I felt that if the trend continues, the day will come where we actually won't be able to preach the gospel freely in this country. And so let's pray for that preservation of freedom of speech and the preservation of parental rights, and also that our children and grandchildren won't be influenced by the LGBTI agenda. And also for courage to speak up for our democratic rights and for the preservation of Christian values. And let's pray for more people, Christian people, to enter public life who have the courage to stand up and to speak for Christian values. And I think in the meantime, we do need to prepare for some persecution. It really is a very real thing.